The frequency of you. A Hood Eloquence original story. The body knows what the mind refuses to accept. Unknown. Chapter 1. The sound that changed everything. Lena Pendel did not believe in disruption. She believed in texture, in the way raw umber behaved differently on canvas than on wood, in the way cold-pressed paper absorbed watercolor like a slow exhale. She believed in the particular smell of her studio at 4 in the morning when the warehouse heat finally surrendered and the night pressed its cool palms against the skylights. She believed in solitude as a creative state, not a social condition. She had never been lonely. Not once in her 26 years had she looked across a room and felt the specific ache of wanting someone in it. She had simply never wanted anyone. Not the men who asked. Not the women who tried. Not any variation in between, or beyond, or beside the categories that other people seem to navigate with such urgent, breathless investment. Desire, as a concept, had always felt to Lena like a language everyone around her spoke fluently while she stood at the back of the room, politely uninterested in learning it. She was not broken. She had checked, in the quiet, careful way she checked most things with research, with honesty, with a mug of black coffee at 2 in the morning. She was asexual, the word a clean-edged thing that fit her like her favorite linen pants, perfectly, without binding. She was also, on this particular Tuesday morning in early October, running exactly 9 minutes behind schedule. The warehouse sat at the eastern edge of Denver's River North Art District, a converted textile factory that Lena had purchased 4 years ago when her work began to sell faster than she could produce it. The building was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. She had done most of the interior work herself, the hand-poured concrete countertops in the kitchen that caught afternoon light like river stone, the bookcase wall she'd built from salvaged gymnasium bleachers, the bed frame she'd welded from reclaimed pipe during a 3-day stretch when she couldn't sleep and needed her hands to do something honest. The living quarters occupied the northwest corner, warm, spare, deliberate. Everything else belonged to the work. The studio dominated the south end, 40 feet of north-facing light and the permanent smell of linseed oil, turpentine, and the particular metallic note of spray paint that never fully left the concrete floor no matter how many times she cleaned it. 2 large commissions were in various stages of completion, an abstract installation for a hotel lobby in Boulder, and a piece she was finishing today, or intended to finish today, before the 9-minute deficit for a private collector in Cherry Creek. The third project was on paper only. A folder on her studio desk, thick with specs and site photographs. Lee Industries. A mural commission, the largest she had ever taken. 42 feet wide, 18 feet tall. A financial security firm that wanted, of all things, a work that felt human. She had not yet met the man who'd commissioned it. She would. In 3 days. For now, coffee. Then the Cherry Creek piece. In that order. Elevation Roast was 2 blocks from the warehouse, tucked into the ground floor of a building that had once been a printing company and still smelled faintly of ink if you sat near the back wall. Lena went there because the coffee was genuinely excellent, because the barista named Priya remembered her order without being asked, and because the walk took exactly 4 minutes at her pace and cleared her head in the way only cold morning air and forward motion could. She pushed through the glass door at 8:14, copper locks piled on her head in a loose knot she'd secured with a paintbrush, wearing a rust-colored thermal and paint-stained wide-leg trousers that she considered completely acceptable public attire. Priya already had the oat milk moving. Morning, Lena. Cherry Creek piece? Finishing it today if it kills me. Same stakes as the last 3 mornings. This time I mean it. She moved to the end of the counter to wait, pulling out her phone to check the image files she'd photographed last night, the piece under the studio lights, the composition's tension in the lower left quadrant that had been bothering her for a week. She was studying the image, head tilted, when she heard it. Not heard. Felt. The laugh came from the corner seating area behind her and to the left, and it moved through the room the way a cello note moves through a concert hall, not loud, not performed, but physically present. A low, rolling, genuinely delighted sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in a chest and travel outward without effort, the way bass frequencies do, passing through walls and bodies alike. Lena's hand stilled on her phone. Her spine straightened. This was, neurologically, the precise moment her body staged a coup. The response was immediate and entirely involuntary, catalogued by her body with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely alarming. Her skin. First, a flush that started at the back of her neck and moved downward with a slow, warm deliberateness, like stepping into a bath that's run exactly right. Not embarrassment, she knew embarrassment, a sharp and localized thing. This was different. This was full surface, her nerve endings registering the air on her skin as somehow too much, every follicle heightening in a way that made her thermal feel like it was lined with electricity. Her stomach. A drop. Not nausea, something almost like nausea's attractive cousin, a plummeting sensation just below her sternum that pulled downward and inward simultaneously, as though her center of gravity had relocated without her permission. She had read about this once. Clinically, the vagus nerve, the gut-brain axis, the body's absurd insistence on processing emotion in the abdomen. She had found it interesting at the time, the way one finds interesting a thing that will never personally apply. She found it considerably less interesting now that it was happening to her. Her chest. A tightness that was not pain, not anxiety, but pressure and expansion of something inside her ribcage pressing outward, as though her lungs had suddenly decided they required more space than they had previously been allocated. She became aware of her own heartbeat in a way she almost never was, a distinct and rhythmic insistence against her sternum, faster than it should have been, faster than coffee or walking or deadline stress could explain. Her hands. She gripped her phone harder without meaning to, her fingers registering a faint tremor she identified 3 full seconds after it began. Not fear. Not cold. Her palms were, incomprehensibly, warm. Warmer than they should have been. She was a person who ran cold. Always, the warehouse in October required 2 layers until noon. But her hands, inexplicably, were almost feverish against the glass of her screen. Her mouth went dry. Her thighs, and this was perhaps the most disconcerting development, tensed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but with a particular and specific awareness of themselves that they had never, to her recollection, demonstrated before. A low, gathering heat there, a sensitivity at the inner surface that she had genuinely no prior reference point for, a feeling that seemed to be communicating something in a dialect she'd never been taught but found herself, to her profound confusion, beginning to understand. Her nipples tightened. She stood very still, processing this information with the focused calm of a woman who has just found an unfamiliar creature inside her home and is attempting to determine whether it is dangerous. The laugh came again. She almost dropped her phone. The second occurrence was worse than the first because her body, having already established its response protocol, executed it faster, the heat, the drop, the pressure, the tightening, all of it arriving simultaneously in a cascade that left her standing at a coffee counter with her mouth slightly open, breathing more carefully than the situation should have required, staring at an image of a painting she could no longer process. She needed to leave. She needed to leave immediately. She needed to leave before she did something that had no logical precedent in her 26 years of being a person, such as turning around, or making eye contact, or saying something, or simply standing here vibrating like a tuning fork that had been struck and couldn't find its way back to silence. Lena. Priya, the coffee. She took it with a hand that was not steady, left a tip that was larger than usual because she did not have the cognitive resources to calculate the correct amount, and walked toward the door. And then she made the mistake of turning around. She told herself later that it was involuntary. That some deeply primitive navigational instinct had rotated her body before her frontal lobe could object. This was probably true. He was sitting in the corner booth, long legs stretched under the table, a tablet in one hand and a mug raised halfway to his mouth, mid-conversation with a man in a suit across from him. He was laughing at something the suited man had said, his head tilted back slightly, teeth white against the deep brown of his skin, and, even in profile, even in quarter view, even across 12 feet of coffee shop, he was the most physically present human being Lena had ever seen in her life. He was large in the way that some men are large when the size is built rather than inherited, shoulders that had clearly been worked for, a neck with an actual architecture to it, hands that wrapped the mug the way a sculptor's hands are made to hold something. He was wearing a charcoal-fitted shirt, no tie, and his head was cleanly shaped, and his jaw was the kind of jaw that made Lena think involuntarily of the word definition in its geometric sense. And then he looked up. His eyes were gray. Soft, impossible gray, the color of sky 20 minutes before it decides whether to storm, light touched at the center, deepening at the edges, utterly at odds with the dark warmth of his face and almost unreal in the way certain things are unreal when they are too precisely beautiful. He had the eyes of someone who paid attention, Lena thought, with the small rational corner of her mind that was still functioning. Eyes that looked and actually saw. They saw her now. The laughter didn't leave his face entirely. It softened, settled, became something more focused as his gaze landed on hers and stayed. Not rudely. Not invasively. Simply with an unhurried certainty, the way a person looks at something they recognize from a distance before they can explain why. Lena felt the look move through her like a current. She turned and walked out of the coffee shop at a pace she would describe, if anyone asked, as purposeful, and would not describe as retreating, even though it was absolutely retreating. Martin Lee watched her go. He watched the rust-colored thermal disappear through the glass door, the copper of her locks catching the October morning light for 1/2 second before the door swung shut. And then he set his mug down with the deliberate care of a man making sure he didn't set it down too hard. Martin. Ryan, his CFO, was looking at him with the expression of a man who has lost the thread of his own sentence. The cue for projections? Right. Martin shifted in his seat, a subtle adjustment that was not as subtle as he intended. There was a specific and undeniable situation happening below his belt that was frankly inconvenient for 8:15 on a Tuesday, and he was grateful for the table. Sorry. You were saying about the liability hedge. But his mind was doing something it rarely did, which was refuse to be redirected. He was turning the image over, the woman at the counter, the paintbrush in her hair, the way she'd stood with absolute self-possession until the exact moment she'd looked at him, and then the brief, unmistakable fracture in that composure. The parted mouth. The wide eyes. The coffee gripped like an anchor. The retreat. He smiled. He knew that retreat. He understood it in the specific way that a person understands a thing they have felt themselves, that particular quality of someone moving away from something because staying is too much. He had looked at her and felt his chest do something unceremonious and immediate that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the particular copper of her skin and the locks and the paint on those trousers and the intelligence in her face in the half-second before she'd bolted. He picked up his tablet, pulled up his calendar. Thursday, 10 a.m. Studio consultation, Lena Pendel, the Lee Industries mural project. He looked at the door she'd exited through. He looked back at his calendar. 2 days. His smile deepened slightly. Ryan was still talking about liability hedges. Martin folded his hands on the table and gave Ryan his full attention because he was a man who followed through on commitments, in business and in everything else, and right now his commitment was this meeting. But some part of his attention, some low and patient frequency, had already shifted its orientation entirely. Chapter 2, Residue. The Cherry Creek piece did not get finished that day. Lena stood in front of it for 2 hours, brush in hand, and accomplished the following: 3 brush strokes she immediately painted over, 1 cup of cold coffee, and a comprehensive audit of everything that was wrong with her body. The audit was not going well. She kept hearing it. That was the problem, or the first problem, or the problem that had generated a cascade of additional problems she was still mapping. The laugh. It would arrive without warning. She'd be mixing paint, reaching into the specific memory of how ultramarine and burnt sienna resolved into the particular gray-brown she needed, and then the sound would simply be there, present in her chest cavity like it lived there now, and her hands would slow and her breath would do something irregular and the heat would come back to her thighs with the patient certainty of something that knew it was welcome. It was not welcome. She set down the brush at 11 and sat on the floor of the studio with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and tried to have an honest conversation with herself, which was something she was generally good at. Okay, she said aloud. The warehouse absorbed the word without comment. She thought about the reading she'd done years ago carefully. About the spectrum. About the difference between asexuality as an orientation and the possibility of aesthetic attraction, of sensory response, of arousal that was physical rather than directed. She had filed those distinctions under interesting but inapplicable, the way she filed most things that didn't match her experience. She thought about how quickly she'd revised that filing. She thought about the gray eyes. Her thighs tightened. She pressed the backs of her wrists against her forehead. This is inconvenient, she told the warehouse. The warehouse agreed, silently, through the medium of existing. She got back up. She went back to the painting. She did not finish it, but she made progress, and at 6 in the evening she stood back and decided it was close enough to done that she could return to it in the morning with fresh eyes and fresh nerves that had, hopefully, been reset by sleep. She did not sleep well. She dreamed of sound. Wednesday was administrative, by design. The day before a significant client meeting required preparation, paperwork, the confirming of logistical details. Lena spent the morning reviewing the Lee Industries specs with the kind of focus she could only access when she was interested in the work itself, independent of any ancillary complications. The project was genuinely exciting. The building's main atrium had a 42-foot accent wall, east-facing, catching morning light through a glass facade. The commission brief, written with unusual specificity for a financial firm, asked for something that communicated growth without literal representation, no upward arrows, no numbers, no abstracted charts. Something that felt alive. Something that made people stop. Lena had already sketched the foundation of an idea, a deep ocean piece, the specific blue-black of the benthic zone giving way upward to bioluminescence, the luminescent forms multiplying and brightening as the eye traveled toward the upper register of the wall. Growth is light. Life asserting itself in darkness. She liked it. She liked it enough that she'd done 8 preliminary sketches without meaning to. She looked at the name on the commission brief. Martin Lee. CEO, Lee Industries, founded 2014. She had not Googled him, because she generally didn't Google clients before first meetings. She preferred to read people in person, without the overlay of curated information. She'd read the company's profile, their community investment record, the philosophy section of their website, which had been written with a warmth unusual for a financial services firm. She had not connected the name to a face. She was not thinking about a face. She was absolutely not thinking about gray eyes and a jaw with an architecture to it. She made tea, reviewed the specs for another hour, laid out her portfolio selects for the presentation, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. She lay in the dark for a long time. The sound came back as it had been coming back all day in fragments, that laugh, that low rolling thing, present in her sternum like a frequency she'd absorbed and couldn't discharge. She tried to examine it clinically, the way she'd have examined an unfamiliar pigment. What is this made of? Where does it come from? What happens when heat is applied? The last question was a mistake. The last question produced a response from her body that was not clinical at all, that gathered low and insistent between her hips with a warmth she had no practiced language for. That made her press her thighs together against the sheets and then feel ridiculous for doing so, and then feel something else entirely that was not ridiculous, that was in fact the most awake and animal she had ever felt in her own skin. She stared at the ceiling. Interesting, she said, in the manner of a scientist who has gotten a result she didn't predict and must now revise her entire model. Chapter 3. The First Meeting. He was early. Lena had not been prepared for early. She had been prepared for 10 o'clock, had calibrated the morning accordingly, the Cherry Creek piece finished and delivered via courier at 8, coffee at elevation with a strict in-and-out policy. 20 minutes to change from paint clothes into something that could be called professional without being dishonest about who she was, and enough time to arrange the studio's consultation area and have her breath at a normal rate before the client arrived. It was 9:51 when the warehouse buzzer sounded. She pressed the intercom. Yes. The voice that came back through the speaker was distorted by the old intercom system, compressed and tinny, and it still landed in her sternum like a dropped weight. Martin Lee. I'm sorry, I know I'm a few minutes early. I can wait outside. He sounded like he meant it. That was the thing, he sounded like a person who would genuinely wait outside in 40-degree October weather because he'd arrived 9 minutes ahead of schedule and considered that his problem, not hers. Her hand tightened on the intercom button. I'll buzz you in, she said. Her voice, mercifully, was steady. Main entrance, straight ahead. She had 9 minutes. She used them to stand very still in the center of her studio and deliver herself a firm internal address about professionalism, about the primacy of her work, about the fact that a voice was just a voice and an attractive face was just a face, and she was a grown woman with a significant career who had navigated client relationships for 7 years without incident, and she was not going to unravel in her own studio over a man she had glimpsed for 4 seconds in a coffee shop. The speech was coherent and well-argued. It did almost nothing. He filled the door frame. That was her first coherent thought when he appeared in the studio entrance, that the door, which was a substantial, 8-foot salvaged warehouse door, looked like a standard-issue door when Martin Lee was standing in it. He was tall enough that the frame would have been close, broad enough that the negative space on either side was minimal, and he was dressed in charcoal trousers and a dark olive knit that did things to his shoulders that Lena noted with the specific, compartmentalized attention of someone who has trained herself to observe visual information without editorializing. She editorialized. He looked around the studio first, not at her, but at the space, with the open attentiveness of someone for whom looking at things is not casual. His gray eyes moved slowly across the work-in-progress canvases, the installation pieces suspended from the ceiling rigging, the wall of reference photographs and sketches, the organized chaos of the pigment shelves. He was taking it in the way a person reads something they actually want to read. Then he looked at her. The fire she'd felt in the coffee shop came back with the specificity of a homing signal. Miss Pendel. He came forward and extended his hand, and his voice, without the distortion of the intercom, was the thing she'd been hearing in her chest for 2 days, deep and warm and unhurried. The kind of voice that made you feel that whatever you were about to say would be heard. Martin Lee. Thank you for having me. His hand was warm. She registered this information from a significant distance, as though a second, cooler Lena were taking notes while the actual Lena shook his hand and said, steadily, Lena. Please. Lena. He said her name like he was tasting it. Not flirtatiously, or not only flirtatiously, she would think later. Like he was deciding something about it. This space is extraordinary. Thank you. I built most of it myself. He looked at her with something that recalibrated. All of it. The furniture. Some of the structural modifications. The install rigging. She gestured upward, where a steel track system ran the length of the ceiling, her mechanism for moving and suspending large-scale work. The welding took me 3 months to get right. You weld. It wasn't a question. It was a man revising his understanding of something. When the work calls for it. He smiled. It was the smile she'd seen in the coffee shop, slightly different at this proximity, less broad, more specific, a smile that was doing more than one thing at once. That's the only reason to learn anything, he said. When the work calls for it. She showed him to the consultation area, a long table she'd built from a single slab of live-edge walnut, chairs she'd upholstered herself in dark linen, good light from the north windows. She spread her preliminary sketches and the Lee Industries atrium photographs, and for the next 45 minutes they talked about the mural the way she talked about work when she was really inside it, directly, with specificity, without performance. He knew what he wanted and could articulate it. That was the first thing. He said, not aspirational, not decorative, but true. I want people to feel something they didn't expect to feel in a financial building, and Lena felt the rightness of that land in her chest the way good ideas always did. He asked intelligent questions. That was the second thing. Not the questions of a client establishing authority, but the questions of someone genuinely curious about how the work was made, about the layering process, about how scale changed the relationship between color, temperature, and emotional register, about why she'd chosen bioluminescence as her conceptual anchor. Deep water, she said, is where things survive that have no right to survive. Things that generate their own light because there isn't any. That felt like a more honest metaphor for financial security than any upward arrow. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. Just that word, but with the weight of someone who had just had something confirmed that they'd intuited without knowing. The meeting ran 20 minutes over schedule. Neither of them mentioned it. He was almost at the door when he turned back, and Lena, who had been managing the particular discipline of not watching him walk toward it, startled slightly. The coffee shop, he said. She met his eyes. Elevation roast. Yes. You left very quickly. There was no useful answer to that. She offered the true one, which was also the one that gave least away. I had work to get back to. He held her gaze for a moment, that unhurried, attentive look, the gray of his eyes doing something she didn't have vocabulary for. Not pressing, just present. I have another site visit scheduled in 2 weeks, he said, but I'd like to be in contact before that. If you need anything from the facilities team, or if questions come up about the brief. He paused. Or for any other reason. The last 4 words were precisely placed. She heard them with her whole body. I'll be in touch, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and left. She listened to his footsteps on the concrete, the groan of the main door, the distant sound of a car. Then she sat down on the edge of the walnut table, pressed her palms flat against the cool wood, and breathed. Her hands were warm again. The heat between her thighs had not dissipated. She had a mural to design and a client who looked at her like she was a problem he was genuinely invested in solving, and she had absolutely no experience with any of the things currently happening inside her body. She picked up her sketchbook. She would draw. Drawing was language she knew. She drew for 3 hours, and if the deep ocean bioluminescence in her preliminary sketches had taken on a new quality, warmer at the light sources, more urgent in the upward movement, alive in a way the first attempts hadn't been, she did not examine the reason. She just kept drawing. Chapter 4. Contact, manufactured and otherwise. He texted the next morning. Not email. Text. Her number had been on the project brief, intended for scheduling logistics, and he had used it for a photograph of the atrium wall in morning light, taken clearly from his phone, with a 2-line message. Sent the facilities team specs this morning. Thought you'd want to see the light at this hour. It's different than the afternoon shots in the brief. Might change the temperature calculations. She stared at the photograph for longer than the photograph required. He was right, the morning light hit the wall at a raking angle that would interact very differently with cool-toned pigments, and she pulled up her color studies and made 3 notations. Then she put the phone down. Then she picked it up and typed, "This changes the entire lower register." "Thank you." His reply came in 40 seconds. "I'm glad. I was there early and thought of you." She read "thought of you" 4 times. She read it as professional context. He was on site. He thought of the artist whose work would occupy this wall. She read it as the other thing, the thing his voice implied when it was unhurried, the thing his gray eyes did when they stayed. She typed, "Good observation." She sent it before she could make it warmer or colder. His reply, "I try." Then, after a beat, "Are you working this morning?" "Always." "What's on?" She looked at the large canvas she'd stretched the night before, primed and waiting, the preliminary sketch transferred in charcoal. The first layer of the Lee Industries piece. She hadn't planned to mention this. She mentioned it anyway, starting your wall. There was a pause of about 30 seconds. His reply, "Somehow that's the best thing I've heard all week." She set the phone face down on the supply table and picked up her palette knife. Her hands were already warm. The second site visit was 2 weeks later, as scheduled, and this time she was ready. She was ready in the sense that she had prepared extensively and was not ready at all. She had spent the intervening weeks in productive, professional contact with Martin Lee that had also, she was increasingly aware, been something else. He texted with unusual frequency for a client, and always with something that justified the text, a logistics question, a photograph, a detail about the building's HVAC system and how it might affect paint cure times, and then, almost always, 1 line after the professional content that existed in the other register. "Tell me what you're listening to while you paint. What are you eating at 2 in the morning?" "I ask because I have a theory. I drove past a converted warehouse district today and thought, there's something honest about a building that shows what it used to be." She had responded to all of them. She had told him she painted to Thundercat and Old D'Angelo. She had confirmed his 2 a.m. theory by admitting to leftover rice and whatever protein was closest. She had said, about the warehouse, "That's exactly right. I didn't want to hide the bones." And he had written back, "Same." She had stared at that for a while. She had gone back to painting and the heat had stayed with her all evening, low and patient and inexplicably certain of itself, as though her body had decided on a direction and was simply waiting for her conscious mind to catch up. The second visit was on-site, the Lee Industries atrium, with the actual wall, the actual scale, the acoustics of the actual space. Lena arrived with a tube of pigment tester colors, her sight measuring kit, and the careful composure of a professional. Martin arrived with coffee. Elevation roast, 2 cups, the oat milk flat white she had not told him she ordered. He must have asked Priya. "How did you know?" she asked. His mouth curved. "I stopped in this morning." Priya is very forthcoming when you explain that the person you're asking about is someone whose work you care about. "You described me as someone whose work you care about?" "Among other things." She took the coffee. Their fingers did not quite touch, but the distance between them was 3 centimeters, and she felt those 3 centimeters with a specificity that should have been embarrassing. She turned to face the wall. 42 feet of possibility. In the morning light he'd photographed, the surface was warm in the upper register and cooler near the floor, just as she'd calculated. She stepped forward and pressed her palm flat against it, a habit, reading the texture, the temperature of the substrate. She was aware, without looking, that he was watching her do this. "You touch things before you paint them," he said. "Not a judgment. Observation. You have to understand what you're working on. The surface has a character. If you paint against it, the work fights you." She moved along the wall, trailing her fingertips. "This one wants something smooth in the lower register. The texture is finer here." The upper section is more porous, the paint will behave differently. She turned and found him much closer than she'd calculated. He had followed her along the wall, and he was perhaps 4 feet away, coffee in one hand, watching her face while she talked about the wall's character. The atrium was not small. He had chosen to occupy 4 feet of it. So you listened to it, he said. Something like that. What is it telling you right now? The question was about the wall. She answered it as though it were about the wall, that it wants to be taken seriously. He nodded slowly. Me too, he said, and it was clearly not about the wall. She measured things after that. Took color readings with her spectrometer, made notes, photographed every quadrant. He stayed, asked intelligent questions, handed her things when she reached for them with an attentiveness that was efficient and also something else. When she needed to mark a measurement at the wall's upper register, 12 feet up, and when to retrieve the telescoping rod from her bag, she turned to find him already holding it. You don't have to. I know. He extended it to her, the rod at the exact length she would have set it. He had watched her use it before, apparently, or had simply calculated. That's why I am. She took the rod. Her hand brushed his. She stood very still for 1 full second and was certain he noticed, because nothing about this man suggested that he missed things. He said nothing. Just watched her work. It was the most effective thing he could have done. She was packing her kit when he said, "Would you like to have dinner?" Not a business meeting. I want to be clear about that. Just dinner, if you're willing. She straightened. She looked at him across the kit bag and the professional equipment and the 18 feet of space between them. And she thought about the heat that had lived in her body for 3 weeks and the warm hands, and the sound of his voice in her sternum, and the gray eyes that paid attention. She thought about the woman she had been before a Tuesday morning in October, and whether that woman was someone she was still in the process of being, or someone she was standing at the edge of. You said not a business meeting, she said. Be clear about what it is. He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention. I want to know you, he said. Simple. Direct. A man who had decided. I've wanted to since the coffee shop. Since before the coffee shop. Honestly, since I read your artist's statement 3 months ago when my team brought me your portfolio. But the coffee shop was when I understood it. Understood what? That you felt it too. He said this without triumph. Without pressure. Like a man stating a thing that was simply true and had no interest in weaponizing it. You don't have to agree with me. She was quiet for a moment. I have dinner at 7:30, she said finally. There's a place on Larimer. The food is good and the music isn't too loud to talk over. His expression did something she didn't have a word for yet, but thought she might eventually. 7:30, he said. Thank you, Lena. She shouldered her bag. She walked toward the atrium exit. Behind her, quiet and satisfied, she heard him exhale, a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh and was entirely, entirely warm. Her whole body heard it. She kept walking, and she did not hide the fact that she was smiling. Chapter 5, Dinner and What Followed. He was at the table before her, which she hadn't expected. She had expected to be early, she was always early, and to have the small advantage of watching him arrive, of composing herself with the landscape already settled. Instead, she walked into the restaurant, and he was already there, standing when he saw her come in, the kind of standing that wasn't performed but simply happened, as though being in her presence required a different posture. He was wearing all black. Simple, fitted, precise. The gray eyes against the black and the deep brown of his skin were the unreal thing again, the thing that shouldn't coexist, but did. You're early, she said. You seemed like the kind of person who would be, he said, so I wanted to beat you to it. She sat down across from him and thought, this man pays attention. The dinner was 2 hours and the menu was secondary. They talked about his childhood in Atlanta, the second son in a house that ran on discipline and ambition, and a mother who read to him in the dark when the electricity was cut because the check didn't clear. They talked about her childhood in Denver, an only child in a house of artists where the television was used exclusively for documentary films and every birthday gift was something that could be made with the hands. They talked about the specific loneliness of being driven, the way ambition creates a perimeter that other people sense, and some choose not to cross. Did it bother you? He asked. The perimeter. No, she said honestly. I never wanted people inside it. She paused. Until fairly recently, it never occurred to me to. He watched her say this. And now? She considered. She was not a woman who performed coyness. Now I'm sitting across from you, which suggests a revision is in progress. His smile was slow and warm and landed on her like sun through glass. For what it's worth, he said, I'm not in a hurry. I'm not interested in rushing whatever this is. He turned his coffee cup. I am interested in being honest about what it is, if you'll allow it. Allow it. I am extremely attracted to you. That started before I met you and it hasn't stopped. I want to be with you in whatever way that means for you, and I'm prepared to earn that, and I want you to know that. He held her gaze. Said clearly, no performance. The heat that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks spread its warmth upward into her chest. I don't have a lot of experience with this, she said. Any experience with this, honestly. You should know that. Tell me. She told him. Simply, without apology, the asexuality she'd understood about herself for years, the absence of prior attraction. The specific and unprecedented experience of hearing his laugh in a coffee shop and having her body rewrite something she'd believed was settled fact. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then, "Thank you for trusting me with that. You're not going to say it's a challenge." "I'm not 14, he said mildly. "You told me something true about yourself. The only correct response is to take it seriously." He paused. "But I also want to say, for the record, I believe you when you tell me what you feel. And I'm paying attention to what you've described. Your body isn't wrong, Lena. It just found something that fits." She looked at him across the table, the candle between them, the ambient noise of the restaurant a comfortable distance, and thought, here is a person who might be worth the revision. "We should talk about the mural's second phase schedule," she said. "We absolutely should," he agreed. "After you tell me what you're thinking right now." She laughed, a real one, unprepared, startled out of her, and his face lit up at the sound of it with such unguarded pleasure that she felt the laugh in her chest long after it had left her throat. "Right now," she said, "I'm thinking that I'm glad I turned around in the coffee shop." He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Palm down, warm, unhurried. Not gripping. Just present. "Me too," he said. His thumb moved, once, across her knuckles. She felt it in places she was only just learning she had. Chapter 6. The Work and the Man. She started painting the wall the following Monday. The scaffolding had been installed over the weekend, and when Lena arrived at 6:15 with her equipment cases and the first of the mixed pigment series, the atrium was empty and quiet, and the wall was waiting. She stood in front of it for a few minutes in the half-dark before the building lights came on, reading it again, letting the scale settle. 42 feet. 18 feet tall. The largest surface she'd ever painted. She changed into her work clothes in the facility's bathroom, a paint-spattered tank, loose pants, bare feet because she always painted bare feet when the surface allowed, some deep instinct about grounding and contact, and climbed the scaffold and began. She had been working for 2 hours when she heard the elevator. Martin Lee came through the atrium doors in a charcoal suit, stopped, and looked up at the wall. He stood very still for a long moment. She watched him from the scaffold. She had the first deep blue-black layer in, covering the lower register with the benthic dark, and the pigment was still wet and light-absorbing, and she was intensely aware of how she looked. Paint-streaked, barefoot, 20 feet in the air, hair wrapped in a cloth. "You're here early," she called down. He looked up at her. The gray eyes were doing the thing again, and he was at least 30 feet below her, and she still felt them. "Did you sleep here?" 6:15. "That's not a no." He came closer to the scaffold. Base, tilting his head back to see the work. "Lena, this is already extraordinary. It's the base coat. I know what I'm looking at." She set down her brush and looked down at him. The light was coming in now at the eastern angle, and it hit the wet paint and made the darkness of it luminous at the edges, and she thought, yes, this is going to work. "How long are you here?" she asked. "I have a 9 o'clock. I wanted to see it first." He paused. "I wanted to see you." She felt this announcement settle into her in the particular way his direct statements always did, not unsettling, not destabilizing, but adding something. "Wait. Warmth. There's coffee in the facility's kitchen," she said. "Priya sent me with 2. He laughed, low, warm, the sound traveling up the scaffold like something physical, and she felt her grip tighten on the rail. She was getting used to this. Not to the reaction. She was not sure she would get used to the reaction, but to the fact of it. To the presence of desire as a new weather system in her body, one she was learning to navigate rather than avoid. "Did Priya say anything?" he called up. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "He's one of the good ones, Lena. Don't overthink it." Silence below. "Then, I'm going to have to get Priya something. She already knows." He stayed for 40 minutes, long past the coffee, watching her work from the atrium floor with his jacket folded over his arm and his tie loosened. He had loosened his tie too. "Watch her paint," she noted, as though formality had been an obstacle to the act of paying attention. He asked occasional questions. He was quiet much of the time. When he left for his 9 o'clock, he looked up at her from the doorway. "Saturday," he said. "I want to cook for you. At mine. If you're willing." She was 14 feet up the scaffold, brush in hand, the beginning of the deep ocean dark spreading below her, and she looked down at this man with his gray eyes and his loosened tie and his completely uncomplicated desire to feed her dinner in his home. "Saturday," she said. His smile traveled through the atrium and up the scaffolding and landed somewhere that was becoming a familiar address. She was still on the scaffold 3 hours later when she became aware that she was painting him. Not literally. Not a portrait. But the bioluminescent forms she was beginning to establish in the middle register, the way they curved upward and toward each other, the quality of the light they generated, the deliberate warmth of the gold she was mixing into the blue-green, were informed by something she recognized with the particular honesty of a person who cannot lie to themselves about their own work. She stood back on the scaffold and looked at what she'd made. 2 light forms, ocean deep, moving toward each other across the wall's midsection. One slightly larger, slightly warmer. Both generating light. The space between them charged with the particular dark that makes light more visible, not less. She had been thinking about his voice and his hands and the way he'd said, "Your body isn't wrong," and she had painted the feeling. She sat down on the scaffold planks and looked at the vast dark of the piece and the small luminous forms that were just beginning, and she thought, so this is what it is to be moved by someone. Not swept. Not undone. Not the desperate, destabilizing things she'd observed in other people and quietly catalogued as unavailable to her. Moved. Like a current that changes your direction without changing your shape. She picked up her brush. She kept painting. Chapter 7. The naming of things. It began, as most honest things between them did, with her saying exactly what she meant. They had been at the walnut table for 2 hours after dinner, his cooking, her warehouse, the night pressing itself in dark sheets against the skylights, and the conversation had moved through its usual registers, the mural's final details, a book she'd been reading about the deep-sea creatures that inspired the piece, something funny Priya had said that week. And then a quiet had come that was not uncomfortable but full, the kind of quiet that has weight and warmth and is waiting for someone to acknowledge what it contains. Lena set down her mug. I want to, she said. Tonight. Here. I want to know what this feels like when it's not just my body having opinions I didn't ask for. Martin looked at her across the table. The lamp behind him put his face in partial shadow and caught the gray of his eyes in the way she'd been cataloging for months now, the soft steel of them warming at the center when he looked at her the way he was looking at her now. Your terms, he said. Not a question. A foundation. My terms. She paused. Which include, you tell me what you're doing before you do it. I want the words. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something more deliberate than surprise, a man recognizing that the thing he'd been given was precisely what he'd hoped for and intending to honor it completely. You want the frequency first, he said. She held his gaze. I want to hear it before I feel it. I want to know if the feeling matches. He stood from the table slowly, unhurried as he was in everything, and came around to her side. Then we'll name everything, he said. His voice dropped to the register that had started all of this, the low, rich, private dark of it. Together. The bedroom was at the warehouse's northwest corner, warm and spare as everything she built for herself. The hand-welded bed frame, the linen the color of undyed wool, the single lamp on the low shelf that threw amber across the concrete floor. She had made this room. Every surface had her hands in it. She felt that now, the particular safety of being on ground she'd laid herself, and she felt, simultaneously, the strangeness of having someone else in it who was not a guest, but not yet something she had language for. Martin stood at the center of the room and did not rush toward her. He looked at the space the way he'd looked at the atrium wall the first time, with the patient attention of someone who understands that what matters deserves to be read before it is touched. Come here, he said. Quiet. Even. Not a demand and not a request, something between them, a third thing, a tone she felt in the back of her sternum like a hand pressed flat against it. She crossed the room to him. She stopped close enough that the warmth of him reached her before contact did. I'm going to put my hands on your face, he said. Just that first. Just my hands. She felt it before he finished the sentence, the anticipation moving down her neck like warm water, her skin already registering the approach of something it wanted. And then his palms came up and cupped her face, thumbs resting at her cheekbones, large and warm, and with a gentleness that she had not known was possible in hands that size, and she closed her eyes. Tell me, he said. My neck, she said immediately, surprised by her own precision. Down the back. Like the first time in the coffee shop, but she stopped. But what? But slower. It's slower now. He made a low sound of understanding and his thumbs moved, barely, tracing the line of her jaw. That's because you're not running from it, he said. You're letting it land. She opened her eyes. He was watching her face with the same quality of attention he gave to art, not consuming, not taking, but understanding. Reading. She thought. This is what it is to be seen. Not just looked at. Seen. What do you want to do next? She asked. His mouth curved. I want to kiss you. Slowly. And I want you to tell me every place you feel it that isn't your mouth. She breathed. Do it. He kissed her the way he did most things, with his full attention and no hurry at all, and she stood in the amber light of her own room and took inventory. My chest, she said against his mouth, the words half-breath. There's pressure. Like something expanding that doesn't fit anymore. Your ribcage, he said low, pulling back just enough to speak, is trying to make room for something new. That's what that is. His hands moved from her face to her shoulders, thumbs tracing the collarbone. I'm touching your collarbone now. Both sides. Tell me. Shoulder blades, she said. They want to, I don't have the word. Open? Open, she confirmed, something releasing in her breath. Yes. Like I've been holding them in for months. You have, he said, and there was no judgment in it, only accuracy, only the particular warmth of a man who has watched someone carefully and knows what they've been carrying. His hands moved down her arm slowly. I'm going to take your shirt off, he said. With your permission. Yes. The word arrived before she had consciously formed it. He did it unhurriedly, lifting the hem, and she raised her arms for him with the focused calm of a woman deciding to trust her own body for the first time and finding the decision easier than she'd feared. The air of the room touched her skin and she shivered, not cold. She knew what cold was. This was the shiver of exposure in the good sense of the word, the shiver of a thing unveiled. Tell me what you feel, he said. He was not touching her yet. Standing close, looking at her, making the space between them a conversation. The air, she said. Every inch of my skin knows exactly where your hands aren't. His breath shifted, a fractional catch, quickly controlled, and she felt the power of that, felt the specific knowledge that she had done that to him with words, that the exchange moved both directions. That, he said, and his voice was lower now, the frequency she'd felt through a coffee shop wall but private now, for her, directed at her like a warm hand between the shoulders, is exactly what I want you to keep feeling. Every moment I'm not touching you is part of it. The anticipation is the first layer. She understood, suddenly, what he was building. Not rushing to the destination. Constructing the experience the way she constructed a mural, layer by layer, each one changing the one beneath it, the meaning accumulating. You're painting me, she said. He smiled, and it was the slow private one she'd been cataloging. I've been wanting to, he said, for a long time. He put his hands on her waist. Spine, she said immediately, before he'd moved at all. All of it. From the base up. I know, he said. I can feel you respond before I move. You're that aware of me. The knowledge in his voice was not arrogance. It was wonder. That's what you do to me too. You should know that. My hands are not steady because of you. They're steady because I'm making them be. The admission moved through her differently than his touch had. Touch was sensation. This was something that landed in the chest and took up permanent residence. Where, she asked. Where are you unsteady? He guided her hand to his chest, pressed her palm flat against it. His heart, beneath the warmth of his shirt, was not the composed thing his face suggested. It was rapid, earnest, fully present. Oh, she said softly. Yeah, he said. They found their way to the bed without hurry, a sequence of small negotiations each announced and each received. Martin narrating in the low deliberate voice she'd been undone by since October, and Lena answering with an honesty she had never had occasion to practice before and found, to her genuine surprise, that she was good at. He said, I'm going to trace your spine with my fingertips. Slowly. From the base to the back of your neck. She said, every vertebra feels like a separate decision. He said, good. I want you to feel each one. She said, the back of my neck, when you reach it, is going to be, and she stopped because he'd reached it, and the word she'd been reaching for dissolved entirely. Say it, he said against the back of her neck, his breath warm at the hairline. I don't have the word, she said, which came out as half laughter and half something that was not laughter at all. I have the feeling, but not the word. I've never needed this particular word before. Then we'll make one, he said. What does it feel like? Like the first mark on a fresh canvas, she said. The commitment of it. You can't unpaint it. It changes everything that comes after. He was still for a moment. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me, he said. She turned to face him in the amber light, this man she had been resisting and approaching in equal measure for months, and she looked at him honestly. Martin. Lena. Stop being patient. He looked at her. For one long moment, the gray eyes warm and dark and very sure, and then he said, tell me what you want. In your own words. Say it out loud. She understood what he was doing. He was giving her the authorship. Making certain that whatever happened next was written in her voice, in her language, on her terms, in her house. She told him. She said it clearly, without performance, in the direct and specific way she described the character of a wall to be painted or the exact shade she was after in a pigment mix. She said it in her own words, and they were good words, and they were hers. His breath left him entirely. Yes, he said. Then, lower, exactly that. What followed was not what she had expected, not because it was more than she'd imagined, though it was, but because it was different in a way she had no prior frame for. It was slow. It was warm. It was characterized by an ongoing conversation that was sometimes words and sometimes sound, and sometimes the specific silence of two people listening to each other so carefully that silence becomes a language. He said, I'm going to, and she said, yes, before he finished, and he paused and said, let me finish the sentence, and she said, you were going to say exactly what I wanted. I was, he confirmed. But I want you to hear it. He told her. She heard it. The sound of his voice in the dark of her own room saying the specific and unhurried thing, the thing that was for her, directed at her, offered to her without condition, hit her somewhere between the sternum and the stomach with a warmth that was almost unbearable in the precise and particular way that the very best things are almost unbearable. There, she said. That place I couldn't name before. In the coffee shop. That's it. I know, he said. I could hear it in you that morning. That's why I didn't look away. You couldn't hear it. I could feel it, he said. From across the room. Some things don't need sound. She catalogued. The warmth of his weight, the specific and particular size of his hands against her skin, the sound of his voice when he was no longer maintaining composure, the way his breath changed when she did something without instruction, and he understood from it that she had arrived somewhere she'd never been and claimed it as her own. She named each region as the heat built through it, not because she had to, but because she had spent months learning this vocabulary, and she wanted to use it, wanted to say the true names of the true things. My throat, she said, at one point when the warmth had climbed that high. Tell me. It wants to make a sound I've never made. Then make it, he said. This is your house. There are no rules here except yours. She made the sound. It was not a small sound. The warehouse absorbed it without comment, as it had absorbed all her private declarations, and she felt no differently about it than she felt about all the things she'd said aloud in this space that had nowhere else to go, which was to say, she felt honest about it. True. present in her own life in a way she had always been in her work and was only now, in this room, in this bed, with this man's voice in her ear and his hands on her skin, learning to be in her body. Near the end, when the warmth had moved through every region she'd catalogued and several she'd had no prior entry for, she was aware of something she could only describe, internally, as coherence. Not the dissolution she'd half expected, not the loss of self, but the completion of it, like a painting finally resolved, the composition found, every element in the right relationship to every other. She pressed her face against his neck. "Martin," she said. "I'm here." "All of it," she said. "Every region. Simultaneously. Right now." He understood what she was telling him. He held her closer, not tighter, closer, the difference being in tension, and said against her hair, in the voice that had started everything, "Then let it." She did. The sound the warehouse received this time was not a word. It did not need to be. Some frequencies carry meaning that language arrived too late to claim. Afterward, the silence was the best kind, inhabited. Full. She lay on her back in the amber light with her eyes on the warehouse ceiling and took a final inventory, thorough and honest as she always was with her own work. Neck, warm. Still carrying a memory of his hands. Sternum, open. The tightness she'd lived with for months had dissolved into something that felt like more room, not less. Stomach, settled. The drop she'd been navigating since October had found its ground. Hands, warm, clasped in his. Thighs, quiet finally, with the specific quiet of something that has been answered. Total self, present. Intact. Entirely, recognizably her. She turned her head and looked at him. He was watching the ceiling too, one arm behind his head, and the gray of his eyes in the amber light was the color the sky becomes in the hour after the storm decides what it is. "Here's what I know," she said. "Tell me." "I'm not different," she said. "I'm not changed. I'm not someone else." She paused. "I'm more. There was a room in me I didn't know existed, and you walked into it and turned the light on, and it was already furnished. Everything in it was already mine. I just needed someone to show me where the door was." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, I want to spend a long time in that room." "You built the key," she said. "With your voice. In a coffee shop. Entirely by accident." He laughed low, warm, the sound rolling through the warehouse and through her chest exactly as it had in October, identical and new simultaneously. The way of frequency is always itself regardless of where it lands. She felt it everywhere. She smiled. "There it is," she said softly. That's the one," she said. "That's the laugh." He turned to look at her, and the gray eyes were full of something she was only beginning to have language for, building it still, adding new words every day the way she added pigment layers, each one clarifying the one beneath. "It's yours," he said simply. "All of it." She looked at the ceiling. She looked at her hands. She looked at this man in the amber light of the room she had built herself and thought, here's the thing I made room for without knowing I was making room. She turned onto her side to face him. "Stay," she said. Her word. Her house. Her terms. He turned to face her. "There's nowhere else," he said. Epilogue, every frequency finally named. The mural was unveiled on a Thursday in January, and Lena stood at the back of the atrium and let the room respond to the thing she had made. She had always done this, stood back. Watched the work receive its audience rather than the other way around. It was not modesty. It was the final act of the process, the release. You build the thing, you live inside it for weeks or months, and then you step back and give it to the air and let it become something that no longer belongs only to you. She had never, before tonight, had anyone to stand back with. Martin was to her left at a distance of 4 inches, which she had measured, without meaning to, the moment he'd come to stand beside her. He was in the dark suit again, the one from their first meeting, and she knew now how the fabric felt under her hands, and how the shoulders beneath it held a different kind of tension than the composed exterior suggested. And this knowledge sat in her body not as distraction, but as warmth, a layer added to the experience of standing next to him, the way each glaze changes the luminosity of a painting. They were not touching. The 4 inches between them contained everything. She watched the crowd. She watched a woman in her 50s stop dead center in front of the piece and go completely still, head tilting back to follow the luminescent forms from the benthic dark to the warm gold of the upper register. She watched a young man take a photograph, then lower his phone and look again, because the photograph couldn't hold what the direct experience gave. She watched a child, someone's daughter, small, in a red coat, point at the 2 central forms in the mural's middle register and say something to her father that Lena couldn't hear. She looked at those forms. The 2 bioluminescent shapes she had painted in the weeks when Martin's voice had been living in her chest and her hands had known something her mind was still debating. Warmer than the others. Moving toward each other across the deep dark with the specific quality of things that generate their own light. She felt him look at her. She let it land, the full warmth of it, the gray of his eyes on her profile, the particular frequency of his attention that she had stopped trying to manage and had started simply receiving, the way you receive light, by being present and open and allowing it to change you. Her neck warmed. Her spine, from the base upward, registered each vertebra. Her sternum opened like a room with the lights already on. She turned to face him. The atrium was full of people and music and the low collective murmur of a crowd being moved by art, and Martin Lee was looking at her the way he had looked at her across a coffee shop in October, the same look, except that now she knew what lived behind it. Had felt it with her hands and her skin and the back of her neck and the unnamed warm region below the sternum that she had been building vocabulary for since the first day he'd walked through her warehouse door. She knew what the look cost him to keep steady. She knew because he'd told her, in the amber light of her room, his heart speaking faster than his face let on. The two in the middle, she said quietly. Just for him. He looked at the mural. He looked back at her. Us. I was painting what I felt, she said. Before I knew what to call it. His hand found hers at their sides, unhurried, his fingers threading through hers in the dark of the crowd where no one was watching, and the warmth of it moved through her palm, through her wrist, through the inside of her forearm in a current that she had ceased to be surprised by and had begun, instead, to depend on in the specific way she depended on north-facing light and the honest character of a good wall. What would you call it now? He asked. She thought about the coffee shop and the October air and the sound that had moved through the wall and through her ribcage and rewritten something she'd believed was settled. She thought about 42 feet of dark ocean and the light that insists on existing in it. She thought about a room she hadn't known was in her, already furnished, waiting. She thought about his voice in the dark of her own room, saying the true names of the true things, and her own voice answering back, and the specific and irreversible quality of the first mark on a fresh canvas. Mine, she said. He squeezed her hand. Across the atrium, the child in the red coat was still looking at the mural. She had pressed her small palm flat against the wall directly between the two luminescent forms, and her father had not told her not to. They were both just looking at the place where the light was warmest, the place where two sources met and made something brighter than either alone. Lena watched this and felt a fullness that moved through every region she had learned, over months of honest inventory to name. Neck, spine, sternum, hands, the warm latitude below. All of it simultaneously. All of it hers. Martin leaned slightly toward her, his shoulder warm against hers, and said against her ear in the voice that had begun everything. You're smiling. I know, she said. Is it the mural? She turned her face toward him, close in the crowd, the gray eyes near enough that she could see the warm center of them, the place where the color softened. No, she said. His smile came slow and private and sure, and it moved through her the way it always had, since the first morning, since before she knew it was possible, like a frequency finding its receiver, like light reaching the surface of the deep water after the long dark rise. Like something that had always been true, finally named. The end. Hood eloquence.